I hear you. I know what you're all saying. Schrantz says this is going to be a 3-part series, but I'm still waiting on part 3. Agree. We need part 3. Somebody know where is the part 3, please? When will it part 3? Where is part 3 of the Feisty French? Where's part 3? When do you make part 3? This is not complete. When do we get part 3, though? It's been 7 months, double cryy face. 7 months? That's not even a long time. Some people have been waiting for the Dutch Leningrad Part 3 for over 4 years. When will you release Part 3? When is Feisty French Part 3? But where is French Defense Blueprint Part 3, though? Skyward-looking hopeful face. Everybody always says that they want a Part 3, but you never actually do, though. Part 3 of any trilogy just ruins everything. You think we really need a Hangover Part 3? You don't think 2 times was already overdoing it? And just look at the numbers. The mighty F3 Banco, 384 views. Maybe 1 extra like would help. Classical Nimzo Part 3, only 1,000 views. I mean, admittedly, things have changed a little bit in the last year on this channel. I like it. But there's a little bit of a coincidence that I'm actually just noticing for the first time. I actually released Part 2 of the Feisty French Defense back on April 21st, 2020. And I'm currently recording this on April 21st, 2021. It's been exactly 1 year since I put out Part 2 of the Feisty French. So I don't know. Is it time for me to actually buckle down and make Part 3? It's something I've actually really wanted to do for a while. So let me know if that's something that you would like in the comments below. But for now, you will have to settle for the Feisty French Part 2.5 out of 3, because I just played a Blitz game that I wanted to share with you guys that actually reminded me of my need to make the Blueprint Part 3. So it's on the radar. I do hear you. I do plan on making it. But we'll see if we get around to it. And this game actually began with pawn to d4, and I did say that this was a French defense game, so somehow, some way, we actually did manage to transpose back into a French defense. And it's kind of a curious thing if you ever go up against one of these Versov players, people that are going to be playing d4 and knight to c3. Very often you can transpose into a French defense, which it's not always obvious who is tricking who, but in this case, I was very happy to play the French as black. And after e5, this is the Steinitz variation, we drop our knight back, and my opponent played a very critical line. This is sort of the line that Anand made very popular, where the pony hops back to e2. And white's plan is just simply going to be to take this huge, massive center. So it really becomes on black to say, you're not going to squash me. If you just sit, if you make one wrong passive move, it's very easy to get crushed here with the black pieces. It's easy to get overrun. So every move needs to be focused on attacking the center. And this is one of the huge battlegrounds of the Steinitz variation. So now comes c3, knight to c6. Again, I'm attacking the center. For now, it is well enough defended, so my opponent plays f4, and I played one of the moves that I've recommended. There's actually kind of a lot of interesting moves here, but queen to b6 is the line that I like. Every single move should be focused on attacking the center in some meaningful way. So here I'm just adding a little bit more pressure to the d4 square. My opponent decides to reinforce it, and now comes time to attack the center again. So all of my moves essentially are just focused on tearing down the center, and it's kind of an interesting question of can white play this way? And it's only due to a lot of really kind of critical tactics that makes this variation even possible for black. So maybe a lot of people would prefer to stay away from these kinds of positions, but I think it's also very dangerous for white, because a lot of these times we're thinking of potential knight sacrifices, particularly on the e5 square. And I don't know, if you do know some theory, you really can get some pretty strong crushing attacks as the black side, because white is not developing the stuff. White's got to get the stuff out there at some point. And from here, there are 2 critical lines. The most popular move is g3, at least in the Lee chess database. It might also be interesting to double check the master database. So this is all of the strongest players over the board games with strong FIDE rated chess players, where you'll see they actually have a preference for a3, which was covered in the blueprint some time ago. But the main point is that white is preventing us from ever playing bishop to b4 check, which is a very important move in the g3 line that we'll see. And if you are curious, if you haven't seen this before, the main game to check out is this Anand versus Shirov game. So Anand did kind of popularize this for white. It's kind of interesting to see. The computer, at least on whatever low depth it's on, thinks that this actually is slightly better for black. Black is a little bit better developed. But this was the critical game where white actually got a very large attack. Here is another critical position. After a3, there's really no better square for this bishop than to just go to e7. But white can choose. White can play b4, h4. h4 was Anand's choice, And we get to these positions where white is basically just going to go for a huge attack, say, hey, I got more space on the king side. I'm just going to go get you. And this was a very fascinating game. And just not to repeat what I've already said in my blueprint, but this is the kind of sacrifice that black is going for. And after this piece sack, I think black actually was fine in the game, but later did go on to lose. So white was able to convert this position. But it's really funny. We've sacrificed a piece for 2 pawns here, but the king is a little bit open. White doesn't have a whole lot developed, but white probably is doing fine here. Really crazy, something interesting that might be worth some time studying if you do decide to play this line. But in my game, my opponent played the move pawn to g3, and here's where I take. And again, this is all kind of theory. I've already studied this. This is well known. And bishop to b4 check. So after this move, this is where a lot of players, you'll see knight c3 is basically the only move, and that's actually what my opponent played. But this is where a lot of players, especially on Lichess, so if we switch it back over and we look at games by all the Lichess players of any rating, here's where real people, I don't know, is it fair to call normal people, real people, people on Lichess that are not super grandmasters, very often they run into this big mistake, and black is very close to winning. Black has a massive position after bishop to d2, so this is one of the main traps that you really want to know about. I'm tempted to put the engine on, but I guess I'll also just test my memory and see how much I remember. The main point is that now we can recapture on e5 in some way, and white has to be very careful as to which way what he wants to do here. There's no real good move. I'm just going to pop the engine on. It's going to say minus 1.5. Something like this is going to be very good for black. It's actually wobbling back and forth between whether it's good or bad. But essentially, if they take back with the d-pawn, this is rare, you have knight c5, if I remember right. Knight c5 scores 100%. But the point is we're threatening checkmate. And the best move for white, if I remember right, is just to capture the bishop. But then there's some even more fun tricks for black. So this is super sharp, critical stuff. Instead of recapturing right away, there's this idea of playing knight to e4, just threatening a checkmate on f2. And the f2 square becomes a kind of a critical focus point. It's one of the squares black wants to keep an eye on in all sorts of these lines. And after queen to b3, we can give the check. The king will have to move over, and now we can take on b4. So this is kind of an interesting critical line. One of the points is if you take back our knight, we take on f3, and it should be really good for us. And maybe white is surviving here, but it looks like a very difficult task. Instead, what you actually should do is I guess you should take the other way, or at least this is the more popular way. But now with this f-file open, black will simply get castled. And after bishop to g2, again, we are going to see that there are a lot of sacrifices. So here we can grab on e5, for example. And yeah, there's no real great way to recapture. The obvious point is that if they capture on e5 with the knight, we again want to be paying attention to that f2 square. Because here we can capture, and they wouldn't be able to recapture us because this would just be a checkmate. And yeah, so additionally, after we do sacrifice a piece, this is very common, we can do this again. And this is like the normal sacrifice. You sacrifice a knight for 2 pawns, but you really do get a strong initiative with the black pieces. The only move to survive, and I think we did cover in the blueprint, it's been a year, but I'm pretty sure we covered what happens if they put a piece on f4. But yeah, all of this leads to a fun time for black. So this is definitely some interesting stuff that is worthy of study if you're interested in playing some of these really sharp French defense lines. Okay, but in my game, my opponent played knight to c3, and this is the proper way of handling bishop to b4 check. I decided to grab on e5, takes, and now castles. So immediately, I am attacking the knight on f3. And after bishop to f4, here, I did decide to play like the famous game. It's a Robson versus Jorgmeyer game. So this is the game that essentially I was following as my model game, where in that game, knight takes e5 was played. And this is one of the coolest moves you can play, because if you just look, it's like this thing is defended so many times. But again, this is just sort of a critical move. And I think the computer will say this is about equal. If you play this perfectly, here it actually gives an advantage to white. Maybe it gives an advantage to me. It doesn't know, but it should be around equal if you let it think for a while. as you can also kind of tell by these strong games where players did happen to make a draw. After D takes, this was actually the first surprise to me. I couldn't remember this. I know that I've looked at it, but the main way of continuing is actually to take back with the bishop, where here again we can take on this guy. And after the knight takes, it gets really interesting because you play a move like this. This is actually the Ray Robson Meyer game, so this one is worth studying. What is really cool about it is the queen sneaks in, and then here, I guess it's already been shown on your screen, but white only has one move in order to save this position. So if white doesn't find the one move, again, we're looking at this f2 square. If white can't find the only move here, you will win the game. But the one move is queen to c1. And this becomes a draw after a long forced line. Obviously, they have to allow this check. And now we take the bishop. So it's this really cool line. And you get to some endgame where you're up a pawn as black. You're up a pawn, but this knight is so good that it should kind of cancel everything out. And yeah, the game continued as such. They got the rooks off the board. Again, we're up a pawn, but with that super strong knight on e5, this game eventually ended in a draw. So with all of that in mind, that was the game I knew, but my opponent decided to take back on e5 with the pawn, which I'm sure I've looked at, but it was around here that I sort of had to think on my own. And I came up with the best move, pawn to d4. This is just exploiting the pin. And after a3, I took on c3. My opponent took back. I take on a2. The rook has to come over. And so far, this feels very pleasant for me. I actually haven't even computer checked this yet. I'm assuming it's probably equal. Maybe I'm a little bit better. We can we can definitely check this out with the computer at the end. But after queen takes b4, queen to d2, this just is a losing move for my opponent because here I spotted queen to e4. And the problem is I'm winning the rook. So at this point, I was able to simply win the game. And here, it was actually pretty funny too. I made a double threat of queen to f5, not only threatening to win this piece, but also to queen. There was nothing for my opponent to do, but he did kind of overlook this. And then I got to exploit this pin a couple different times before he threw in the towel. So one last time, just running back through it, here is one of the cool lines. I just want to encourage people to check this out, especially if you like really critical, sharp stuff. This is one of the more fun lines that you can play against the French. And if they do decide to take with a pawn on e5, d4, this seems to be the way to go. But yeah, it was definitely... yeah, it's just a lot of fun. So here my opponent has to play king to f2, walking into kind of this pin. And this actually is really interesting because it's not immediately obvious to me. I want to like sack this. I want to sacrifice my knight. I want to sacrifice my rook. But it really doesn't seem like anything is working. So I don't know what I would have done. Maybe I just would have played b6, bishop to b7. I'd have to have a good hard think here. This would have definitely made it a little bit more challenging, but in any case, I should be fine. And very often in these positions, you might be down a piece, but you always have some initiative because, you know, king's on f2, and we got this pawn, and stuff's going on. But yeah, that's it. This is the game that I wanted to share with you guys today. I really might make part 3. I really might. If you really want it, let me know. And yeah, it's just kind of cool looking back a year ago and where we've come today. So, yeah, a little bit of nostalgia.